One of the ways we can solve a polynomial equation is to set it equal to 0 and put it in factored form. Look at this example here. It says 2x squared plus 7x minus 15 equals 0. That's a quadratic equation. We can solve, that's a quadratic in standard form. We can solve this by graphing it and seeing it where it hits the x-axis. Or we could use our quadratic formula, and we could come up with the solutions that way. Another way we could do it is to factor it out. In a future lesson, we will learn how to factor a quadratic equation. But if you look at this one right here, this is called factored form. And it's factored form. A polynomial is in factored form if it's written as a product of two or more linear factors. So there could be 3 or 4 linear factors here, but remember these are linear because 2x minus 3, that's x to the first, that's a linear function. X plus 5, that's linear because it's x to the first. Just to show you real quick, and you wouldn't have to do this, if we were to multiply this out, our first terms, it would be 2x squared. Outside is 2x times 5, which would be 10x. Inside is negative 3 times x, so plus a negative 3x. And last is negative 3 plus 5, which is a negative 15. We end up with 2x squared, excuse me, plus 7x minus 15. And remember, see, that's what we have right here. Okay, so this is factored form, this is standard form. Don't worry about converting between the two yet, we'll get there. But once something is written in factored form, we can use the idea of the zero product property to solve. So here's the zero product property down here. Basically what it says is let a and b be real numbers. If a times b equals 0, then either a has to be equal to 0 or b has to be equal to 0. Basically, if something equals 0, one of the factors has to be 0. 5 times 0 equals 0. So if we had 5x equals 0, what does x have to be? X has to be 0. Because if you're going to multiply by 0, you get 0. And that's all the zero product property states. So if we can write it in factored form, set it equal to 0, what that means is either this factor has to be equal to 0, or this factor has to be equal to 0. Remember, in this example, it being a quadratic, we know it has two solutions. And if it's set equal to 0, one or the other has to be equal to 0. Okay, so let's look at some examples of how we can solve equations in factored form. Solve the equation, the quantity x minus 4 times the quantity x plus 1 equal to 0. Since it equals 0, either this part here has to equal 0 or this part here has to equal 0. So all you do is say x minus 4 equals 0 or x plus 1 equals 0. Then solve these equations. Add 4 to each side. Really at this point you probably can just look at this and know that this has to be 4. Or subtract 1 from each side, or you can look at it and know that x has to be equal to a negative 1. So instead of using the quadratic formula, instead of graphing it, if it's in factored form, the beauty of factored form is that you can come up with your two solutions pretty quickly. One of them has to be 0. Let's look at another example. Now this one says solve the equation the quantity x plus 8 squared equals 0. Remember what that actually means is x plus 8 times x plus 8. The exponent tells us to take the base and multiply by itself. These are the exact same thing. You don't need to set them both equal to 0. You can just say x plus 8 equals 0. Subtract 8 of each side, and you get x equals a negative 8. In this case, there is only one solution. Technically there's two. We're going to say the parabola is like almost hitting the x-axis twice at negative 8, but not really. It's just kind of sitting at the x-axis at negative 8. Okay, so there really is only one solution here. It's just a repeated solution because of that too. Okay, so if you have a problem like this where it's raised to the second power, don't worry about doing it twice. You can just do it once because it's what we say a repeated solution. So our solution here is just x equals a negative 8. Let's look at one more example. Now notice in this one, it's actually a cubic equation. There's 3 linear equations here, or linear expressions. Treated the same way. If this times this times this has to equal 0, then one of them has to equal 0. So we're just going to set all 3 equal to 0. So solve each of them. At this point here, ladies and gentlemen, when I'm dividing both sides by 3, just leave it as 2/3. Don't write it as 0.67 or 0.6 repeating. It's okay to have a fraction in your answer, because the same thing is going to happen here. We'll get a -3/4. Again, guys, be careful. Don't lose your negatives anywhere. So in this case, our solutions are 2/3, -3/4, or -4. So again, just to kind of sum it up, because of our zero product property, if we set something equal to 0 and it's written in factored form, that means one of them has to be equal to 0. So set them both equal to 0, solve, and you get your solutions to your polynomial equation.